I spent my whole life on construction sites, saving up $60,000 to gift my family a vacation in Miami. But at the airport, my son, Mark, looked straight past me and said, "I forgot to buy you a ticket, Dad. Go home." What he didn't know was that a man who spent his life building also knows exactly how to bring down a house of lies, brick by brick. Hello there. It's your friend and host for the story. Have you ever put all your trust in someone, only to discover that trust was entirely misplaced? If that sounds familiar, let me know with a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from. Our connection is our strength. That morning, the air in Cleveland Hopkins Airport had that particular Ohio chill to it, the kind that gets right into your bones. But I didn't feel it. I was warm, really warm, for the first time in a long while. I pushed a luggage cart piled high with brand new suitcases, the wheels making a soft, rumbling sound on the polished tile floor. This wasn't just a trip, it was a beginning. At 65 years old, after 4 decades of breathing in concrete dust and yelling over the roar of machinery, I was about to use my life savings to put a down payment on a house in Miami. A place where my kids, and one day their kids, could make memories in the sun. I could already see it all so clearly. Me, teaching my grandson how to bait a hook on a pier, or just sitting on the porch with a cold Miller Lite, watching the sun go down. It was my legacy, something solid, something you could touch, not just empty words. It was the whole point of all those years of breaking my back, to build something that would last longer than I would. My son, Mark, was standing over by the check-in counter with his wife and their 2 kids. I smiled, pushing the cart towards them, ready to share in the excitement. But Mark stopped me before I got there. He put a hand out, not to welcome me, but to halt me. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like I was just a stranger in his way. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, like he was reading a boring weather report. There'd been a change of plans, he said. The real estate people had to reschedule, and he'd already canceled my ticket. "Just go on home and relax, Dad," he said, his thumb still scrolling on his phone. "I'll handle things from here." Those words, "go on home," hit me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal. An order. I just stood there, frozen, feeling like all the air had been sucked out of the terminal. My daughter-in-law, Lisa, didn't even glance in my direction. She was too busy adjusting a pair of expensive-looking sunglasses. The 2 grandkids were glued to their iPads, their little digital worlds completely uninterrupted by the old man being cast aside. Mark gave my shoulder a quick, meaningless pat, a touch without any warmth, any connection at all. And then he turned his back. He herded his family into the line, shuffling toward the security gate. Not a single one of them looked back. Not once. In that moment, I wasn't a father anymore, not a grandfather heading off on a family adventure. I was an obstacle, a problem that had been neatly solved. I watched them walk away, their shapes getting smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the crowd. And a feeling of being completely invisible washed over me. I was just a ghost in the middle of a loud, bustling airport. I don't really remember how I got back to the parking garage. The drive home in my old Ford F-150 felt like it took a lifetime. The first thing I did was turn off the radio. The silence inside the cab was more comforting than any of the cheerful songs playing on the airwaves. My calloused hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles showing white. I'd driven this truck to work every single day for 15 years. It had seen me through snowstorms and summer heat waves. It had never once let me down. But today, my own son had. His words just kept playing over and over in my head, cold and sharp. I tried to find an excuse, some kind of misunderstanding that would make it all make sense, but I couldn't. The coldness in his voice hadn't been accidental. It was deliberate. It was the sound of a door being shut in my face. The house greeted me with a silence that felt heavy, suffocating. Everything was exactly as I'd left it just a few hours earlier, filled with hope. But now, the joy was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The travel itinerary I'd printed out was still lying on the kitchen counter, a piece of paper that now felt like a cruel joke. I sank down into my old lazy boy recliner, the one my late wife Martha used to call my throne. I didn't even bother to take off my Carhartt jacket. I just sat there, staring out the window at the gray Ohio sky, feeling that chill of betrayal seep deep into my bones, a cold far worse than the weather. This house, the place where I'd raised a family, where every wall held a memory of laughter, now felt colder and emptier than it ever had before. As the afternoon light faded into a gray evening, the initial shock started to wear off, and something else took its place. Suspicion. You don't make it as a construction foreman for 40 years without learning how to spot a crack in the foundation, a weakness in the structure. And Mark's story, it was full of cracks. Why cancel the ticket at the last second? Why not call me beforehand? Professional real estate companies don't just reschedule a major closing like that over a text message. And his tone, that casual, indifferent tone. No, this wasn't just a change of plans. This was something else. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And I knew, with the same certainty that I knew how to read a blueprint, that I had to find out what it was. The foundation of my own family felt like it was crumbling, and I needed to know why. Sleep wouldn't come. It was impossible. My mind was a racetrack of unanswered questions, each one chasing the other in a frantic loop, leaving me exhausted but wide awake. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up the fight. Swinging my legs out of bed, the sudden chill of the old floorboards under my bare feet felt like a shock to the system. I went down to the kitchen and performed a ritual I knew by heart, brewing a pot of Maxwell House coffee, making it extra strong, the kind of brew that could cut through fog on a cold worksite morning. I needed a clear head, not one clouded by shock and confusion. I fished my worn leather wallet out of yesterday's jeans and pulled out the business card Mark had handed me a few weeks back with a casual flick of the wrist. Sunbound Real Estate, the name proclaimed in a fancy, looping script. It was printed on glossy paper that felt thin and flimsy between my calloused fingers, like a cheap suit trying to look expensive. I stared at the phone number, a Miami area code that looked alien to me. All my life, I've believed in tangible things you can measure and test, things with solid foundations. And this card, this flimsy piece of paper, was the first thing I had to test. My hand trembled just a little as I punched the numbers into my old flip phone, the plastic buttons clicking softly in the dead quiet of the house. I knew it was still the middle of the night in Miami, but I couldn't wait. The need to know was a physical ache in my chest, a pressure building behind my ribs. I pressed the phone to my ear, expecting it to ring, bracing myself for a sleepy, annoyed voice. It didn't ring. There was just a short, electronic bleep, followed by a robotic, disembodied voice. The number you have dialed is not in service. I hung up, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself I must have misdialed. Taking a deep breath, I tried again, dialing each digit with painstaking care, as if my concentration alone could will the number into existence. The same result. The same cold, automated message. The silence that followed the recording was somehow worse than any angry words could have been. It was a void, a complete emptiness where a real estate company, where my dream, was supposed to be. My $60,000 dream, the culmination of a lifetime of work, built on a number that led to nowhere. I walked out to the garage, my sanctuary. The familiar smell of motor oil, sawdust, and old leather instantly calmed my frayed nerves, grounding me in reality. This was my world, a place where everything followed clear physical laws. I flipped on the overhead light and a warm, yellow glow illuminated the neat rows of DeWalt tools hanging on the pegboard wall. My tools. I could remember teaching a young Mark how to hold a hammer right here, his small hand wrapped around mine. I reached out and took down a heavy-duty power drill. The solid, balanced weight of it in my hand was real, dependable. Out here, if something was broken, I could fix it. If a joint was loose, I could tighten it. I could take things apart, see how they worked, and put them back together, stronger than before. But this fracture in the trust I had for my own son, I had no idea how to even begin to fix something like that. I didn't have the right tools. There wasn't a blueprint for this kind of damage. Returning to the kitchen, I opened up my old laptop. It whirred and groaned as it took its time booting up. I'm no expert with these things, but I know my way around a Google search. With a sense of dread, I typed in the name Sunbound Real Estate. The search results came back almost instantly. Nothing. No official website, no address in a business directory, not a single customer review, good or bad. It was as if the company had never existed outside of that cheap business card in my wallet. A real chill, one that had nothing to do with the Ohio night, ran down my spine. Almost out of habit, my fingers clicked over to Facebook, the only social media I use, and only then to see pictures of my grandkids. And that's when I saw it. A new photo album from my daughter-in-law, Lisa, posted just a few hours ago. The title was a gut punch. Living Our Best Life in Miami. The first picture loaded, bright and painfully clear. It was Mark and his whole family, smiling, their faces radiant and happy on the deck of a sleek, white yacht. The Miami skyline glittered behind them like a distant promise. Mark was holding up a colorful cocktail, looking more relaxed and carefree than I'd seen him in years. The next picture showed them at a dinner table in a restaurant that screamed money, with plates of glistening seafood and steaks I didn't even recognize. My stomach tightened into a hard, cold knot. This wasn't a business trip to look at a house for the family. This was a 5-star vacation. A vacation paid for with my money, paid for by the 40 years I got up before the sun, in weather that would freeze your bones, paid for by a bad back and knees that ached every single time it rained, paid for by these 2 hands, scarred and worn from a lifetime of hard labor. I stared at my son's smiling face in the picture, at the easy happiness there, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't recognize the man I was looking at. Social media has made it so easy to share the beautiful moments, but sometimes it also brings the painful truths right to your screen. Have you ever discovered something heartbreaking about a loved one from a post online? It's a strange and difficult feeling, isn't it? If you feel comfortable, share your story in the comments. We're all here to listen to each other. My old oak desk has always been a place of order in a world that often felt chaotic. Everything has its place. Bills to be paid on the left, checkbooks and ledgers on the right, a neat row of sharpened No. 2 pencils lying perfectly parallel in a wooden tray my father made. For years, this desk was my command center. It was where I calculated the cost of lumber and concrete, where I figured out payroll for my crew, and where I balanced our family's budget down to the last penny, making sure every dollar had a purpose. Now, sitting here in the pre-dawn quiet with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, It was about to become my investigation room. I settled into the familiar worn leather of the chair, feeling its solidness beneath me. It was a small comfort in a world that had suddenly turned to quicksand. There were no more feelings to trust, no more words to believe. It was time to face the numbers. Because numbers, they don't have it in them to lie. They are what they are. Cold, hard, and true. I navigated to the bank's website, a monthly ritual that now felt heavy with a suffocating dread. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a nervous, unsteady rhythm, like a machine running out of oil. This wasn't just a routine check anymore. This was a search for a wound. I typed in my username and password, the familiar characters feeling foreign under my fingertips. A part of me, a small, foolish part that sounded a lot like the younger man I used to be, was still praying for a simple explanation. Maybe a wire transfer that was just delayed, a clerical error, anything but the ugly truth that was beginning to form in my gut. The screen loaded, the little blue circle spinning for what felt like an eternity. Then, the summary of my savings account appeared. Our savings account. The one Martha and I had opened the week after we got married, with a $50 deposit that felt like a fortune at the time. The account that held 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and shared dreams. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself for whatever was on the other side of that click. The first shock was what wasn't there. There was no single, clean transaction for $60,000 to a title company. The space where that clean, hopeful number should have been was empty. Instead, my eyes scanned down a long, sickening list of withdrawals. They weren't one big hit. They were a series of small, persistent bites, like a rat gnawing away at the foundation of a house. $1,000 here, $2,500 there, another $1,500 a day later. Dozens of transactions, all made within the last 10 days, a relentless draining of the account. They were all cash withdrawals from ATMs. My mind, trained to see patterns in chaos, worked quickly, adding them up. The total, it was almost exactly $60,000. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring slightly, trying to make sense of the madness. Why cash? Why so many small amounts? It felt methodical. It felt sneaky. It was the work of someone trying to cover their tracks, someone trying not to be noticed as they bled a life's work dry, one paper cut at a time. My hand, steady now with a cold purpose, moved the mouse to click on the details of one of the transactions. An ATM address appeared on the screen. The name of the street sent a jolt through me. It was familiar. I clicked on another one. A different street, but just as familiar. A cold map began to form in my mind, the locations of the ATMs like red pins on a board. They were all clustered in a few-mile radius around the Horseshoe Casino down in Cincinnati, a place I knew Mark visited more than he should, a place he always called just a bit of fun. The final puzzle piece slid into place with a devastating, silent click in my head. This wasn't a down payment. This wasn't for a house. This was gambling money. My son hadn't just lied to me. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had taken the one tangible thing Martha and I had built for our family's future, and he had fed it, piece by piece, into a slot machine. I moved the cursor and clicked the print button. In the corner of the room, my old, reliable printer whirred to life, its mechanical noises the only sound breaking the heavy silence. It groaned and whined as it pulled in a sheet of paper, then another and another. Each page that slid out was a document of my ruin, a chapter in a story I never wanted to read. I reached over and picked up the stack of papers. They were still warm from the machine, The black ink stood out stark and brutal against the clean white paper. This was it. This was the proof. It wasn't just a suspicion in my gut anymore, not just a gut-wrenching photo on a screen. It was real. It was tangible, black and white. Holding those statements in my hand, the hot, searing pain of the last 24 hours began to change. It cooled, hardened, and settled deep in my chest, transforming into something else entirely. Something cold, heavy, and solid as steel. With the stack of bank statements lying on the oak desk like a funeral shroud, I knew I had to call him. I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. A deep, weary part of me, the part that just wanted peace after a lifetime of noise and struggle, pleaded with me to just let it go. It whispered that maybe it was better not to know, to just throw the papers in the trash, burn them, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the other part of me, the foreman who spent 40 years facing problems head-on, knew you couldn't build anything on a cracked foundation. You don't ignore rot, you cut it out before it brings the whole structure down. I paced the worn carpet of the living room, a path I'd walked 1,000 times while worrying about deadlines or sick kids. The phone felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, the printed statements a lead weight in the other. I rehearsed what I would say, my lips moving silently. I would be calm. I would be factual. I would lay out the evidence, line by line, withdrawal by withdrawal. I would give him a chance to explain, to tell me there was some terrible misunderstanding, even though the cold, hard steel of truth in my chest told me there was no explanation that could fix this. This wasn't a mistake. This was a demolition. Finally, I stopped pacing and stood by the window looking out at the gray Ohio sky that seemed to mirror the emptiness inside me. My thumb hovered over Mark's contact photo, a picture of him smiling with his arm around my granddaughter, a smile that now looked like a mask. I pressed the screen. He picked up on the second ring. His voice burst through the speaker, impossibly cheerful and relaxed. "Hey, Dad, you caught us just as we're heading to the beach. It's beautiful down here." That voice, that carefree, happy voice, broadcast from a paradise bought with my life savings, was a physical blow. It was like a shard of glass in my ear, sharp and hot. I could almost hear the faint sound of seagulls in the background, a soundtrack to my betrayal. How could he sound like that, knowing what he'd done? I took a breath, forcing the tremor out of my own voice, making it as flat and solid as a slab of concrete I'd poured 1,000 times. "Mark," I said, the name feeling strange and foreign in my mouth, like a word I no longer recognized. "We need to talk about the savings account." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. But it wasn't the silence of surprise or confusion. It was a dense, calculating silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the quick, frantic search for the right lie, the right angle. It was the same kind of silence I'd heard on job sites right before a worker tried to explain away a costly mistake. When he spoke again, his voice had completely changed. The manufactured joy was gone, replaced by a tone I'd never heard from him before. It was a thick, syrupy, patronizing tone, dripping with phony concern. "Oh, Dad," he sighed, drawing the word out as if speaking to a confused child who just asked a silly question. "We talked about this, remember? I explained it all to you before we left. Did you forget again?" The words hung in the air, a direct assault. Did you forget again? He wasn't just denying. He was rewriting history, painting me as the one whose mind was failing, the one whose reality couldn't be trusted. And then the real poison began to flow, each word carefully chosen, wrapped in the guise of patience and love. He talked about under-the-table fees for the real estate deal, complicated cash transactions that were necessary to grease the wheels. He used jargon he knew I wouldn't understand, talking about escrow and closing costs in a way that was meant to overwhelm and confuse me. "It's just how business is done these days, Dad," he said soothingly. "It's not like the old days with a handshake. These things are complicated for—" He paused, as if searching for a gentle way to say it, "for your generation." Then came the direct hits, precise and cruel. "You know, your memory hasn't been the best lately. It's okay. It happens to everyone when they get older." Each sentence was a carefully aimed blow, designed to chip away at my confidence, to make me question my own sanity. He wasn't just covering his tracks, he was trying to erase my mind, to make me an unreliable witness to his own crime. Then he delivered the final, brutal twist of the knife. "Look, why are you trying to ruin this vacation for the kids?" he asked, his voice now laced with a sharp frustration, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Everyone is having such a great time, and you're calling and bringing up things we've already settled." And there it was. In the space of 30 seconds, he had transformed me from the victim of his theft into the villain of his story. I was the confused old man, the party crasher, the bitter father, jealous of his own family's happiness. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. He hadn't just stolen my money. He was now trying to steal my dignity, my identity as a father, my very reality. I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a vast, cold emptiness. There was nothing left to say. There was no one on the other end of the line I recognized as my son. I didn't yell or argue. There was no point. I simply moved my thumb, a slow and deliberate motion, and ended the call. The click of the button, a quiet, final judgment. After the call ended, the hot, boiling rage that had filled my chest began to cool. It didn't disappear. Instead, it solidified, settling into a cold, hard clarity in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't do this alone. I saw that now with perfect certainty. This was no longer a family matter, not a simple argument between a father and son that could be fixed with a stern talking to. This had gone far beyond that. This was something else, something calculated and ugly. I needed more than my own suspicions. I needed facts. I needed proof that couldn't be twisted or denied by gaslighting words. And to get that, I needed someone I could trust, someone outside the tangled mess of my own family. I walked out to my wood shop, the familiar scent of sawdust and motor oil a small comfort. I looked at the rows of tools hanging neatly on the pegboard wall. My hammers, my saws, my levels. Each one had a specific purpose, a job it was designed to do perfectly. And right now, I knew I needed a different kind of tool, a human one. A tool that could find the things other people wanted to keep hidden. The first and only name that came to mind was Mike Sullivan. We'd worked shoulder to shoulder on job sites for nearly 20 years, framing houses in the summer heat and pouring foundations in the freezing Ohio mud. He'd left the construction business a decade ago to start a small private security firm, doing background checks and surveillance. Mike was a straight shooter, a man who measured twice and cut once, both with wood and with words. Calling him felt like a monumental task. It was admitting a deep, personal failure. For a man of my generation, you handled your own problems. You didn't air your family's dirty laundry for the world to see. It felt like I was betraying some unspoken code. But then I looked at the bank statements still sitting on my desk, and I knew pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. Mark had already burned that bridge. I picked up the phone, my knuckles white as I gripped it. When Mike answered, I kept my voice even, laying out the facts as if I were reporting a structural issue on a blueprint. There was no emotion, just data. "Mike," I said, my voice flatter than I thought possible. "It's Steve. I need you to find a few things out for me, and it needs to be quiet." The next few days passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. Every time the phone rang, my stomach clenched. Every car that drove down my street made me look up from whatever I was doing. The waiting was a unique kind of torture, a thick, heavy silence filled with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. Then, one morning, it was there. Tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery store flyer was a plain manila envelope. No return address, nothing to distinguish it from junk mail except for the fact that it felt heavy, substantial in a way that junk mail never does. My heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I didn't open it at the mailbox or even in the kitchen. I walked it straight out to the woodshop, my sanctuary, the only place where I still felt like I was in control. I placed it on my workbench, right next to a set of half-finished blueprints for a birdhouse I was planning to build for my grandkids. For a long time, I just looked at it. The envelope, a symbol of a future I was supposed to be building, and the blueprints, a symbol of the one that was being torn down. Finally, I picked up my utility knife and slit the seal with a sharp, clean cut. My hands were surprisingly steady as I tipped the contents out onto the smooth surface of the workbench. A few photographs slid out first. They were grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens, but the subject was unmistakable. It was Mark. In the first photo, he was walking through the ornate doors of the high-stakes poker room at the casino, a place I knew he had no business being. But it was his face that stopped my breath. This wasn't the smiling, carefree man from the vacation photos on Facebook. The man in this picture looked tired, his shoulders slumped with a weight I'd never seen him carry. His face was pale and drawn, his jaw tight with stress, and his eyes were constantly moving, darting from side to side like a cornered animal searching for an escape route that wasn't there. This was him. This was the real Mark, stripped of the cheerful mask he wore for the world. This was the face of desperation. Beneath the photos was a single sheet of A4 paper, folded neatly into quarters. I picked it up. It felt impossibly light after the weight of the pictures. I unfolded it. It wasn't a complicated report, it was just a list. A list of names. Some I vaguely recognized as local low-level bookies, and next to each name was a number. The numbers were cold, brutal, and unforgiving. They represented debts, gambling debts. Adding them up in my head, the total was staggering. It was more than he could ever hope to repay on his salary. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle locked into place. The money he stole from me wasn't just for a lavish vacation. It wasn't a simple act of greed. It was the desperate act of a drowning man, an addict so deep in a hole that he was willing to pull his own father down with him just to get a few more seconds of air. I carefully folded the paper back along its original creases and placed it on top of the photos, making a neat, orderly pile on my workbench. I expected to feel rage, a white-hot anger at the confirmation of it all, but I didn't. There was no satisfaction, no feeling of being proven right. All I felt was a deep, hollow sadness that seemed to settle into my bones. So I wasn't crazy. My instincts, honed over a lifetime of spotting flaws and weaknesses, had been right all along. But the validation was the most bitter thing I had ever tasted. My son, my boy, was in more trouble than I could have ever imagined. And instead of coming to me, his father, for help, he had chosen to betray me, to steal from me, to lie to my face and try to convince me I was losing my mind. The path forward was no longer clear. I had the proof now, the cold, hard facts, But this was no longer just about getting my money back. This was something far more complicated. My search for answers was over, but I had a terrible feeling that my real journey was just beginning. Today is the anniversary of Martha's passing. The Ohio sky was a familiar sheet of gray, a solemn blanket that seemed to understand the occasion. I don't do anything special on these days. There are no grand ceremonies, no visits to the cemetery that feel more for the living than the dead. I just want to be close to the things she loved, the things that still hold a piece of her. The worn Ford F-150 rumbled down the familiar streets toward the bank, but the comforting rhythm of the engine did little to soothe the disquiet in my soul. My plan for the day was simple, a quiet ritual I'd performed every year since she was gone. I was going to retrieve my father's old Omega watch from the safe deposit box. It was a beautiful timepiece, but its value had nothing to do with the gold it was made of. Martha had loved it. She used to say its gentle, steady ticking was the most peaceful sound in the world. On this day, I would take it out, wind it carefully, and spend the afternoon cleaning and polishing it, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. In its quiet presence, I could feel a connection to both of them, a conversation across time with the two people who had anchored my world. The bank was an imposing building of granite and glass, a fortress of quiet commerce. A young teller with a polite, practiced smile led me from the bright, open lobby into the vault. The air changed instantly, growing cold and still, carrying the faint metallic scent of money and time. A massive, circular steel door, a monument to security, stood open. Inside, the only sound was the soft echo of our footsteps on the polished marble floor. The teller, a young woman who couldn't have been much older than my granddaughter, led me to my box. The ritual was always the same, a quiet ceremony of security. She inserted the bank's key into one lock, a gesture of institutional trust. Then, I pulled my own key from my pocket and inserted it into the other. There was a satisfying heavy clunk as the tumblers aligned. She slid the long metal box from its slot and handed it to me. It felt heavy, solid, a container of secrets and history. "The first viewing room is available, Mr. Patterson," she said softly. I nodded, took the box, and walked into the small, wood-paneled room, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing me in with the ghosts of my past. I sat there for a moment in the sterile silence, the metal box sitting on the small table in front of me. It was a time capsule, a physical anchor to a life that sometimes felt like a dream. Taking a slow, steadying breath, I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, everything was as it should be, a neat and ordered collection of a lifetime's milestones. Mark's birth certificate, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges. My marriage license to Martha, her signature a beautiful, confident swirl of ink. A small bundle of letters she'd written to me when I was away on a long job, tied with a faded silk ribbon. My eyes scanned the contents, searching for the familiar dark blue velvet box. It was in its usual spot, tucked in the back corner. I reached for it, my fingers anticipating the soft texture. But as I lifted it, a jolt went through me. It was light. Impossibly light. A sudden, sickening emptiness flooded my chest, a cold dread that preceded conscious thought. My heart gave a painful lurch. With trembling hands, I slowly, deliberately lifted the hinged lid. The white silk lining was pristine. The perfect, watch-shaped impression in the fabric was still there. But it was empty. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It couldn't be gone. I must have moved it. Maybe I'd taken it home last year and forgotten. But I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the steel vault door, that I hadn't. I never took it home. Its place was here. I dumped the entire contents of the safe deposit box onto the table, my hands frantically sifting through the papers, the letters scattering. But there was nothing. No watch. Just the hollow velvet box and its mocking, empty indentation. And then a memory surfaced, sharp and brutal, cutting through my panic. The keys. There were only 2 keys to this box in the entire world. One was on my key ring, currently sitting on the table. The other I had given to Mark 5 years ago. I remember the day perfectly. I had pressed it into his hand. "This is for an emergency," I had told him. "If something ever happens to me, you'll need this to sort things out." It was an act of ultimate trust, a father preparing his son to be the steward of the family's legacy. The air rushed out of my lungs. The violation was so profound, so complete, that it transcended anger and went straight to a place of pure, bottomless pain. This was infinitely worse than the money. Money was just paper, just numbers on a screen. I had spent my life working. I could, in theory, earn more. But this was different. The watch was my father's promise, my wife's memory, the tangible thread connecting 3 generations of Patterson men. By taking it, Mark hadn't just stolen an object. He had stolen a piece of our family's soul. He had reached back in time and desecrated the memory of his own mother, and he had done it on the one day of the year that was sacred to her. In that cold, silent room, I felt the last frayed thread of fatherly affection, of hope for some misunderstanding, simply snap. It wasn't a loud, violent break, but a quiet, clean severance. All doubt, all hesitation, all the weakness of a father's love for his son vanished. There was no longer a family problem to solve. There was only a line that had been crossed, and I knew, with a clarity that was as chilling as it was absolute, that I would do whatever it took to get it back. Walking out of the bank vault, the cold silence of the viewing room still clinging to me, I knew the time for personal investigation was over. The game had changed. This was no longer just about a son disappointing his father. This was about a thief who had violated something sacred. The next morning, I drove downtown. The lawyer's office was on the 15th floor of a sleek glass tower that reflected the Cleveland sky. Everything about it, the polished chrome, the hushed carpets, the faint, clean smell of paper and freshly brewed coffee, was the complete opposite of the chaos churning inside me. My world was dust and sweat, the smell of sawdust and the roar of machinery. This world was quiet, ordered, and sterile. A young paralegal led me into a conference room with a panoramic view of the city square below. I sat down in a cool leather chair that sighed under my weight and placed my old, worn briefcase on the gleaming mahogany table. The contrast was almost comical. My battered case, a relic of 1,000 job sites sitting on a surface that had probably never seen a speck of dust. But for the first time in weeks, surrounded by this immaculate order, I felt like I was in exactly the right place. My lawyer, David Chen, was younger than I'd expected, a sharp man in his late 30s with a calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't waste time with small talk. He shook my hand firmly, sat down, and simply said, "Tell me everything." I didn't hold back. I opened my briefcase and laid out the evidence piece by painful piece across the polished table. The bank statements, their columns of withdrawals a testament to the methodical theft. The grainy surveillance photos Mike had given me, showing a haunted-looking Mark outside the casino. The list of gambling debts, the numbers a cold, hard summary of his desperation. I told him the story chronologically, keeping my voice as steady and factual as I could, the way I'd deliver a progress report on a construction project. I detailed the events at the airport, the phone calls, the gaslighting. Then I told him about the watch. My voice, which had been a low, steady monotone, cracked just once when I mentioned Martha's name. Through it all, David listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't show a flicker of surprise, just made meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching quietly in the silent room. When I finished, a heavy silence settled over the room. David stared at the papers spread across the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. He picked up the list of debts, then the bank statements, comparing them. "The timeline is aggressive," he said, more to himself than to me. "The withdrawals match a pattern of someone chasing losses." He looked up at me, his gaze direct. "Mr. Patterson," he said, his tone shifting from listener to analyst, "I need to see every financial document you've signed in the last 12 months. Loan applications, tax forms, insurance papers, anything and everything that has your signature on it." I was a bit taken aback. "What for?" "This is all about the savings account," I said. He held up a hand. "A man this desperate and this methodical doesn't just empty a savings account. He secures his access first. Please, just bring me everything." Though I didn't fully understand, I trusted his professionalism. The following week, I returned, hauling in a thick accordion file filled with a year's worth of paperwork. He took the file and began to work through it page by page with a practiced efficiency. I sat in silence, watching, until he stopped at one particular document. "Here it is," he said, his voice flat and serious. "6 months ago. Do you remember Mark bringing you this? He would have told you it was for your annual tax filing." He slid the paper across the table. I looked at it. The memory was foggy, buried under the weight of more recent betrayals. But I did remember. Mark had come over one evening, papers in hand, all smiles and efficiency. He'd said his accountant had found a new deduction for retirees and just needed my signature on a routine form. He was so helpful, so considerate. I was proud of him for taking an interest, for helping his old man out. I trusted him. I'd signed it without reading the fine print. Who reads the fine print when it's your own son? David pointed to a dense paragraph of small, tightly packed text at the bottom of the page, a section designed to be overlooked. "This clause here," David explained, his voice calm but edged with steel, "is a durable power of attorney. It grants your son incredibly broad authority to conduct financial transactions on your behalf. He can access accounts, transfer funds, even sell property. Legally, when he was making those withdrawals, he was acting as you." The blood drained from my face. My heart felt like a block of ice in my chest. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a desperate, spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a trap. A carefully constructed, legally binding trap that he had set for me 6 months ago. He had been planning this all along. That single, horrific realization didn't break me. It did the opposite. It forged my grief and sadness into something hard and sharp. A white-hot flame of pure, unadulterated resolve flared up inside me, burning away the last vestiges of a father's guilt. The man who did this wasn't the boy I had raised. He wasn't my son stumbling through a terrible addiction. He was a calculated predator who had used my trust and my love as weapons against me. The line had been crossed long before the money was ever touched. David watched me, his expression unreadable, waiting for my reaction. I met his gaze, and he must have seen the change in my eyes. "What's our first move?" I asked, and my voice was no longer the voice of a grieving father. It was the voice of a man who was ready for a fight. A small, grim smile touched David's lips. "Our first move," he said, picking up his phone, "is to file an emergency petition to freeze every single account he has access to." We cut off the supply line. Immediately. I gave a single sharp nod. It was a beginning. A clear, decisive action in a sea of confusion and pain. I left the lawyer's office feeling like a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The burden was still there, of course, heavy and real. But now, I wasn't carrying it alone. I had an ally. I had a strategy. As I stepped out of the glass building and back onto the street, the sun finally broke through the gray Ohio clouds, casting long shadows across the square. I knew the road ahead would be long and ugly. There would be no easy victories. But as I walked toward my truck, for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could see the end of it. And I knew I would walk every last damn step. There wasn't much for me to do after that meeting with David. My part, the painful work of gathering evidence and facing the truth, was done. Now, I just had to provide the information and trust the process. The legal machine, once set in motion, moved with a speed and efficiency that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. David and his team were like a well-oiled engine. An emergency petition citing financial elder abuse and supported by the bank statements and the power of attorney document was drafted and filed with the court in a matter of hours. The judge signed the temporary order almost immediately. I sat at home in my lazy boy chair, the house wrapped in its usual silence. But for the first time in a long while, the quiet wasn't heavy with grief or confusion. It was the charged, expectant silence before a storm makes landfall. It was the quiet of a plan in motion. I knew that thousands of miles away, in the sun-drenched paradise Mark had bought with my life savings, the world he had constructed was about to be hit by a Category 5 hurricane, and he wasn't going to see it coming. And then, it happened. I only learned the specific details later, pieced together from reports and my own grim imagination. But the picture was crystal clear. Mark, high on his own arrogance, had taken the family to one of the most expensive steakhouses in Miami Beach, a place with white tablecloths, glittering chandeliers, and a panoramic view of the Atlantic. They were living the high life, a perfect performance for Lisa's social media. I can just see it. Them ordering bottles of wine that cost more than my first car, laughing as they feasted on marbled Kobe beef, the very picture of effortless wealth. It must have been the peak of their delusion, the ultimate celebration, all of it funded by my 40 years of breathing concrete dust and the sacred memory of my wife. When the extravagant meal finally came to an end, the bill arrived on a small silver tray. Mark, playing the part of the magnanimous patriarch, probably made a show of it, pulling out his premier credit card with a confident flourish. The waiter, a professional accustomed to catering to the wealthy, returned a few minutes later. His polite smile was a little strained, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "I'm very sorry, sir," he would have murmured, leaning in discreetly, "but this card has been declined." I can picture the flicker of annoyance on Mark's face, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He'd wave it off as a mistake, a technical glitch, and produce a second card from his wallet, perhaps a different color, an even more exclusive brand. The waiter would retreat and return again, this time with a more pronounced look of apology. "This one as well, sir. I'm afraid it's also been declined." The first seeds of real panic would have started to sprout in Mark's chest then. A third card, his emergency backup, would be offered with a tight, forced smile. And when that one too was rejected, the performance would be over. The confidence would evaporate, replaced by a cold, sweaty panic, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. I can see Lisa's smile freezing, then crumbling, her face a mask of public mortification as she felt the eyes of the other diners turning toward their table, sensing the drama. The whispers would start. For people like them, who lived and died by appearances, This public shaming was a fate worse than any financial loss. The grand illusion of success and power, so carefully curated, had just been shattered in the most humiliating way possible. In the end, stripped of his stolen power, he had to make a shamefaced call to a friend to come and settle the massive bill. The curtain had come down on his pathetic play. It took less than an hour for the fallout to reach me. My old flip phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, signaling a new voicemail. It was from Mark. I stood there for a moment looking at the screen, then deliberately pressed the button to play it on speaker. The voice that filled the quiet room was not one I recognized. The smooth, condescending tone was gone. The fake, cheerful persona had been burned away. What was left was the raw, guttural snarl of a cornered animal. A man whose entire world had just been pulled out from under him. "You think you're so damn smart, old man?" he screamed, his voice distorted with a rage so pure it was almost bestial. In the background, I could hear the gentle, ironic sound of waves lapping against the shore. "You have no idea who you're messing with. You want to humiliate me? You want to ruin my life?" The threats came pouring out, a torrent of blame and venom. "When I get back, you're going to pay for this. You hear me? You're going to wish you'd never been born." I stood perfectly still, listening to the tirade until the message ended abruptly. I didn't feel a flicker of fear. The man screaming threats into a phone was not my son. He was a stranger, a desperate creature lashing out blindly. With a calm that surprised even me, I saved the voicemail. I forwarded the audio file to David with a simple, one-line email. "I believe this is what you were waiting for." Mark's rage had made him sloppy. This threat wasn't just the ranting of an angry son. It was a textbook example of elder abuse and intimidation. It was the final piece of evidence we needed, the nail in the coffin he had just built for himself. I walked out to my wood shop, the scent of cedar and oil calming my nerves. I ran my calloused hand over the smooth, unfinished surface of an oak plank on my workbench. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no joy in this victory. There was only a cold, quiet peace, the satisfaction of a well-laid plan, the feeling of a structure, once dangerously unstable, finally being made right. The balance of power had shifted. He just didn't know it yet. After the first few legal strikes, an unusual quiet descended upon my life. The storm of discovery and confrontation had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was clear but stark. The legal process would grind on, David assured me, and a portion of the money would likely be recovered. But as the days settled into a new, calmer rhythm, a larger, more persistent question began to surface in the quiet hours. It would find me in the wood shop, my hands idle on a piece of wood, or in the evenings, sitting in my chair, staring out at the darkening street. The question was simple. And then what? What was the ultimate purpose of all this? What was the endgame for the life I had built, for the money I had earned through 40 years of sweat and sacrifice? The original plan, the dream of a family legacy in Miami, was now a pile of ashes. The very thought of leaving my life's work to the person who had so thoroughly and cruelly betrayed me was a physical revulsion, a sour taste in the back of my throat. My legacy could not be a reward for deceit. It would make a mockery of everything I had ever stood for, of every lesson I thought I had taught. I wanted my work to mean something again. I needed it to. My mind kept drifting back to the job sites, to the faces of the young men I'd trained over the years. I remembered a kid named Ricky, barely 20, with hands that were still soft but a work ethic as solid as concrete. I remembered him showing me a picture of his newborn daughter, his eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. "I just want her to have it easier than I did, Steve," he'd told me during a lunch break, the city noise a dull roar around us. I want her to be able to go to college, you know? I saw dozens of faces like his. Good, honest men who showed up every day in the freezing cold and the blistering heat to build a better life for their families, just like I had. I thought about their children, kids with bright eyes and boundless potential, whose futures often depended on the narrow margins of a construction worker's paycheck. And slowly, like a blueprint coming into focus, an idea began to form. It wasn't a bolt of lightning, but a quiet, steady warmth that spread through my chest, a feeling of peace and rightness that I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. A week later, I was sitting across from David Chen again in his 15th floor office. The tension of our previous meetings was gone, replaced by a quiet, collaborative energy. The city spread out below us, a testament to the kind of work I'd spent my life doing. On the gleaming mahogany table between us lay a thick stack of freshly printed documents. David had taken my idea and given it the language of the law, shaping my quiet hope into an ironclad reality. "It's an irrevocable trust," he explained, pushing the document toward me. "Once you sign this, it cannot be altered or undone by anyone." I picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen he offered me. The last time I'd signed a document Mark had given me, it had been an act of blind faith. This time my eyes were wide open. The pen felt solid and sure in my grip. My hand didn't tremble as I wrote my name on the signature line, Stephen Patterson. It was a strong, steady signature, the signature of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. With that single stroke of ink, everything I owned, the house that Martha and I had made a home, the investments I'd carefully chosen, the remainder of my savings, was no longer just my property. It had been given a new purpose. The sole beneficiary of the Patterson Family Trust was not Mark. It was a scholarship fund. David read the official title aloud, and the words filled the quiet room with a profound sense of permanence. The Steve and Martha Patterson Scholarship for Families in the Building Trades. My legacy would not be a vacation home enjoyed by a thief. It would be an education. It would be a future. The fund would provide full college tuition for the children of electricians, plumbers, masons, carpenters, the hard-working, unsung men and women who, brick by brick, pipe by pipe, had built the very city outside that window. The satisfaction I felt in that moment was deeper and more real than any sun-drenched fantasy of Miami could ever have been. I was still a builder, I realized. I wasn't building with concrete and steel anymore. I was building futures. I was creating opportunities that would ripple out into the world long after I was gone. This felt like a true legacy. This felt like something Martha would have been proud of. People often think of a legacy in terms of money and property, things you leave behind for your children. But I've learned that sometimes a true legacy has nothing to do with bloodlines. It's about the values you lived by and the opportunities you create for others who share those values. What do the words legacy mean to you? Is it about what you pass down or what you build up for the world? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Driving home that afternoon, something felt different. The weight in my chest was gone, replaced by a feeling of lightness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I reached over and turned on the radio. An old John Mellencamp song was playing, one of those anthems about small-town life and American dreams. I found myself smiling, a real, genuine smile. The world outside my truck window, the city I had spent my life helping to construct, seemed brighter. In a way, I had lost a son. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger I no longer knew. But in doing so, in being forced to confront the ugliest of truths, I had found something I hadn't even known I'd lost: myself. I'd reconnected with the core of who I was, not just a father, but a builder. A man whose legacy wouldn't be defined by one broken branch on the family tree, but by the forest of new trees he could help plant. And I, an old construction foreman from Ohio, finally understood that was more than enough. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. In the weeks that followed, my life found a new, quiet rhythm, punctuated by periodic updates from David's office. The legal battles were happening in a world of paperwork and court filings, far removed from my own. I spent most of my time in the wood shop, losing myself in the scent of sawdust and the predictable logic of measurements and joinery. I was building a grandfather clock from a single slab of cherry wood, a project that required patience and precision. Two things I was rediscovering in myself. Then, one evening in late October, the outside world came knocking. A fierce autumn storm was raging, the kind of Ohio squall that rattles the window panes and makes the old house groan. The rain was coming down in sheets, a relentless drumming tattoo against the roof. I was settled deep in my lazy boy, a wool blanket over my lap, reading a book on the Battle of Gettysburg, when I heard it. A frantic, desperate knocking on the front door. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor. It was the sound of someone at the end of their rope. I put my book down, my heart not with a jolt of alarm, but with a slow, heavy certainty. I knew who it was. The storm had finally brought him home. I didn't hurry. I walked to the door and looked through the small peephole. Mark stood on the porch, illuminated by the single pale yellow light, looking like a drowned rat. He was a pathetic caricature of the man who had left for Miami. The designer clothes that had looked so impressive in the Florida sun were now soaked through, clinging to his frame, wrinkled and ruined. His hair was plastered to his forehead and the rain dripped from his chin. But the real change was in his face. The arrogance, the condescending smirk, the calculated confidence, it was all gone, washed away. In its place was a raw, hollowed-out exhaustion, the look of utter and complete defeat. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The wind whipped a spray of cold rain into the entryway. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. "Dad," he began, his voice a hoarse croak. "Dad, I was wrong. I messed up. I've lost everything. Lisa took the kids and left. Please, you have to help me." He was playing his last card, the one he had saved for the very end. He was trying to weaponize pity. I didn't move from the doorway. I didn't invite him in out of the rain. I just stood there, a solid, unmovable object, and looked at him. I looked at this stranger on my porch, this man who wore my son's face, and I felt nothing. The white-hot rage had burned out long ago. The deep, aching sadness had given way to a quiet emptiness. There was nothing left to say. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between us, no argument that could change the facts. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the language of betrayal and consequences. I'd prepared for this moment not with angry speeches or accusations, but with a single, simple truth. Without a word, I turned from the door, walked the few feet to my oak desk that stood in the living room, and picked up a single sheet of paper. Then I walked back to the open doorway where he still stood, shivering. I held the paper out to him. His hand trembled as he took it. It wasn't a letter. It was a ledger, a professionally printed statement that David's office had helped me prepare. It was a cold, emotionless accounting of the last 5 years. It detailed, line by line, every dollar I had given him since he'd dropped out of college. The tuition payments for classes he never finished, the money to start a business that never materialized, the loans to pay off credit card debts, the bail money after that one ugly night in Columbus. Every date, every amount, every broken promise was there, recorded in the stark, unforgiving clarity of black ink on white paper. It was the blueprint of his failures and of my misguided hope. At the very bottom of the page, beneath the neatly typed columns and the staggering final tally, I had added 2 lines myself. I'd written them earlier that day, my handwriting slow and deliberate, the careful script of a man used to drawing straight, true lines. The first line read, "Financial debt, $142,850. The second line, right below it, read, "Debt of trust, incalculable." He stared at the paper, his face growing paler under the porch light, the color draining away until he looked like a ghost. He looked from the paper up to my face, his eyes searching for something. An opening, an accusation. He was probably expecting me to yell, to finally unleash the fury he so richly deserved. He was hoping for a fight, because a fight would mean there was still something there to fight over. But I refused to give him one. I had nothing left to say to the man who had stolen my wife's memory and my father's legacy. This wasn't about punishment. It was about finality. It was about closing a chapter that had caused more pain than I had ever known. My role in his life, and his in mine, was over. I looked him in the eye one last time, holding his gaze until he looked away, defeated. And then, slowly and gently, I closed the heavy oak door. The lock clicked into place with a quiet, definitive sound that echoed in the silent house. It was the sound of an ending, the sound of a boundary being drawn, the sound of peace. I walked back to my chair, the storm still howling outside, and picked up my book. I found my place, and I continued to read. The rain beat against the windows, but inside my home, inside my heart, the storm was finally over. The sky was clear. That click of the lock was the end of one story, but in the quiet that followed, I've come to realize it might be the beginning of another, a conversation that needs to be had. I know that when we men, who've seen a good part of life, sit down together, the stories often just start to flow. Today I wanted to open my heart a little, and I'm truly hoping to hear from you fellas too. You know, sometimes something as simple as a click, a like, a subscribe, or a share can seem like a small, fleeting thing to most people. But to me, and to the other quiet voices that need to be shared, every single one of those is a light turning on in a dark room. It says, "I see you, I hear you, your story matters." Now that I've told my story, what I'd like most is to listen to yours. In the comments below, I would be deeply honored if you would share a piece of your own story. When was a time you felt dismissed or unheard? What's a passion you had that someone else thought was foolish? Or what was a moment you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please, share. I will read every one and carry those stories with me, because your story is important. WAWA Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have something sad to tell today, then share a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this video on a television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and look for my WAWA Ages channel. Let's build a place together where no man has to feel that his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me. It means the world.